July 9, 2006. Domodedovo International Airport, Moscow, Russia. A Siberia Airlines, S7 Airlines, Airbus A310 was preparing to operate a domestic passenger flight, designated Flight 778, scheduled to fly from Moscow to Irkutsk. There were a total of 203 people on board, 195 passengers and 8 crew members, including 6 cabin crew and 2 pilots. Seated in the left seat of the cockpit was 45-year-old Captain Sergei Shabanov, considered one of the most experienced pilots at Siberia Airlines. He had been with the airline for 9 years and 7 months, and had previously flown a variety of aircraft, including the Antonov AN-12, AN-24, Boeing 757, and Tupolev Tu-154. He had accumulated a total of 10,611 flight hours, including 1,560 hours on the Airbus A310.
Seated in the right seat was 48-year-old First Officer Vladimir Cholnik. Like the captain, he had also been with the airline for over 9 years. He had a total flight time of 9,971 hours, including 158 hours on the Airbus A310. At 17:17 local time, after receiving clearance from the control tower, the crew departed from Domodedovo Airport, and the flight proceeded normally en route to Irkutsk. At 21:46, while cruising at an altitude of 11,100 meters, the crew established contact with Irkutsk Regional Air Traffic Control and reported their estimated arrival time as 22:40. They also reported their alternate airport as Bratsk. Air traffic control then instructed them to continue flying at 11,300 meters toward the descent point, with a planned descent to 5,700 meters. At 10 p.m., just before entering Irkutsk control zone, Flight 778 received updated weather information for the destination. Surface wind from 280 degrees at 4 meters per second. Horizontal visibility 3,500 meters. Vertical visibility 1,700 meters. Light rain. Temperature 11 degrees Celsius. The runway was wet.
16 minutes later, Flight 778 began its descent. Air traffic control instructed the crew to descend to 5,700 meters and to establish contact with Irkutsk approach control. At 22:25, the crew reported to Irkutsk approach that the aircraft was passing the Rostoli waypoint at an altitude of 5,700 meters. ATC then cleared them to descend further to 2,100 meters. 7 minutes later, the crew used the ATS automatic weather system to receive the latest weather update. The surface wind had slightly shifted from 280 degrees to 270 degrees, and the cloud base had risen from 170 meters to 190 meters. All other parameters remained unchanged. The pilots were now preparing to land on a wet runway under challenging weather conditions. Adding to the difficulty, the aircraft had a deactivated thrust reverser. Just a few days earlier, during a previous landing in Irkutsk, the right thrust reverser on this aircraft had failed, followed shortly by a failure of the left one, leaving the aircraft without any reverse thrust capability.
Because thrust reversers are critical for decelerating the aircraft after landing, a dual thrust reverser failure posed a serious threat. Under such circumstances, continued operation of the aircraft is strictly prohibited. To fix the issue, Siberia Airlines Maintenance Department replaced the damaged actuator on the right thrust reverser by using the still functioning actuator from the left thrust reverser. As a result, the left thrust reverser was marked as inoperative, and the aircraft was configured to retain only a functional right thrust reverser. With this configuration, the aircraft was approved to resume flight operations.
At 22:36 local time, Siberia Airlines Flight 778 was approaching Irkutsk Airport. Following the captain's instructions, the first officer deployed the flaps to 20 degrees. At 22:40, Irkutsk Tower contacted the crew and cleared Flight 778 to land on runway 31. As the aircraft passed the outer marker at an altitude of 240 meters and a speed of 257 kilometers per hour, the first officer reported the position to ATC. At 22:43, when the aircraft was 1,500 meters from the runway threshold and flying at 105 meters altitude, the crew disconnected both the autopilot and auto throttle systems. The aircraft made a smooth touchdown shortly thereafter. Immediately upon landing, the captain engaged maximum reverse thrust on the right engine. However, the left engine's reverser was not activated and remained at idle. As the aircraft slowed to 185 kilometers per hour, the captain began to gradually reduce the reverse thrust on the right engine to ensure a smooth rollout.
However, when the captain pushed the right engine's reverse thrust lever forward to stow it, his palm accidentally nudged the left engine's throttle lever, which caused the left engine to spool up into takeoff power mode, while the right engine was already disengaging reverse thrust and slowing down. 20 seconds after touchdown, the right reverser was fully stowed, but the left engine had already reached 60% of takeoff thrust. As a result, the Airbus A310 stopped decelerating, and just 10 seconds later, it began to gain speed again. The flight crew quickly realized something was wrong. They had already landed, but the aircraft was now accelerating. At the same time, the takeoff configuration warning suddenly sounded in the cockpit. This confused the pilots. They had already landed. Why was the aircraft giving a takeoff warning? In reality, when the left engine thrust exceeded a certain threshold, the aircraft's computer assumed a takeoff was in progress. Since the aircraft's flaps, slats, and stabilizer were not in their takeoff positions, the system triggered the warning, even though they were on the runway.
However, the first officer did not attempt to identify the cause of the warning. He simply assumed it was a system error and silenced the alarm. The first officer then reported to air traffic control that the aircraft had landed safely, completely unaware that a disaster was about to unfold. Because of the high forward thrust from the left engine, the spoilers automatically retracted, which in turn disabled the auto brake system. At this point, the aircraft had already used 1,600 meters of the 2,450-meter runway. It was only then that the captain realized the aircraft wasn't decelerating. The first officer tried to re-engage the right engine's thrust reverser, but because the left engine was providing significant forward thrust, the aircraft's safety system blocked the reverser activation, a built-in protection designed to prevent reverse thrust from being deployed during flight or takeoff. The runway end was rapidly approaching. Despite their efforts, the pilot still hadn't figured out why the aircraft couldn't slow down. The captain shouted in desperation, struggling to control the aircraft as it fought against the asymmetric thrust. The plane skidded right, then veered left, before suddenly swerving hard to the right again and finally overshot the runway at 180 kilometers per hour.
At 22:44 local time, S7 Airlines Flight 7778 overran the runway at a speed of 180 kilometers per hour. The aircraft broke through the airport's concrete perimeter fence and crashed into several private garages. The nose section was completely destroyed, and a major fire broke out inside the cabin, engulfing the aircraft in flames and thick smoke. Victoria Cherepovitskaya, a 22-year-old flight attendant, freed herself from debris and managed to open an emergency exit located above her. Thanks to her and the other crew members' efforts, 20 passengers were able to escape through that exit. Victoria was the last person to leave through it. Another flight attendant, Andrei Gakanov, followed emergency evacuation procedures under intense heat and smoke. He helped evacuate 30 passengers, sacrificing his life in the process. In total, the crash claimed 125 lives, including the captain, the first officer, and 3 cabin crew members. It remains one of the deadliest accidents in Russian civil aviation history.
The investigation into the crash of Siberia Airlines Flight 778 was conducted by the Interstate Aviation Committee of the CIS. The final report was released on April 19, 2007. According to the report, the crash of Flight 778 was caused by pilot error during the landing rollout and loss of control over engine thrust. After landing with only one functioning thrust reverser on the right engine, the captain unintentionally and uncontrollably advanced the left engine throttle from idle to high thrust while attempting to control the right engine's reverse thrust. The first officer failed to monitor the engine thrust indicators and aircraft speed, despite multiple alerts and warning signals. Although the crew had sufficient time to recognize the issue, they did not take action to return the left engine to idle or shut off the unintended thrust. As a result, the aircraft accelerated on the wet runway, overran the runway at high speed, collided with concrete barriers and buildings, and caught fire, ultimately being destroyed by the blaze.
On December 9, 2008, the East Siberian Transport Prosecutor's Office officially terminated the criminal investigation, citing the deaths of both the captain and first officer in the accident. However, subsequent technical evaluation suggested that the crash may have been related to abnormal system responses within the aircraft's control systems, design flaws in those systems, logic errors in the onboard flight computers, and reduced braking effectiveness. The accident was believed to have been caused by unexpected software behavior in response to the aircraft's landing status, rather than pilot or ground crew error. In February 2009, the investigation was reopened to allow for further technical analysis. The revised conclusion found that the aircraft's collision with ground obstacles was caused by an increase in thrust from the left engine, possibly due to pilot input by the captain. However, investigators were unable to determine whether this action was intentional or accidental, or caused by some other factor. Due to conflicting expert opinions and a lack of complete cockpit data, the investigation ultimately concluded that the most likely cause was the captain inadvertently increasing the left engine's thrust after landing, combined with the crew's failure to monitor or intervene effectively. On March 1, 2010, the criminal case was permanently closed, again citing the pilot's death.